Let's talk about analytics in general. When does the need for analytics arise? It arises when we are faced with that part of politics, mainly, which is carried out according to the principle, he who knows, he will understand, and he who does not know or does not understand, these are his problems. And those who are interested or simply curious, they are not included in the circle of those who are informed of what constitutes the subject of knowledge of that politics that is carried out according to this principle. Then the question arises, what is happening in the world, in the country or somewhere there? And then the analytics arise. Analytics are based on scattered facts that the analyst either looks for himself or which he has carefully slipped in order to manipulate him. Among these facts there can be both reliable and deliberately invented, unreliable. Then, for analytics, a methodology of cognition that is functionally operable is necessary. And since any methodology of cognition is refracted through personal subjectivism, then it turns out that the analytics can reveal some process about which it is not customary to talk, or about which no one even suspects. But by virtue of the fact that not all facts are reliable, or their incompleteness takes place, the methodology may be somewhat erroneous. Plus, subjectivism is nraviously conditioned and may also be somewhat erroneous. By virtue of all this, the analytics always contains some inherently unreliable information, or, in other words, an error. Therefore, this circumstance must always be taken as a given. The second question has to do with how we are going to use analytics. And here it turns out that the more valuable for us the expected result, the more strict we should be in the selection of analytics. Because if the analytics always contains an error, then this error may be such that it will simply devalue the result. Therefore, always working with analytical results, this is a certain risk, and with this risk, something needs to be done in the process of governance. What to do? To create such a mood where intuition says that, yes, in the analytics everything is logical, flawless, the facts are reliable, but nonetheless this is a complete unreliability, and it must be responded to. Or, it is reliable, but due to the fact that the processes are beyond the control of those who are fully engaged in them, the result will be completely different. Therefore, if there is analytics, then there must be an intuition that would evaluate it simply by heuristic methods outside of any formal logic, that is, a sense of measure. This applies to any analytics, including the analytics which Valery Viktorovich Pyakin publishes on the internet. And we must give him his due. In the majority of cases, his analytics is of good quality, but although sometimes there are those things when the flight of fantasy turns out to be of more weight than what actually takes place. Again, this is not a reproach. This is a property of any analytics that is produced by any human reason. And what Valery Viktorovich Pyakin does is blago, because he shovels large amounts of information, which many would never have reached by themselves. He gives out a kind of summary. Well, further, dear comrades, this is not done so that you rely on him in everything, but so that you think for yourself, including being critical of his analytics. Because as far as I know, the prophets among us are somehow not visible, who would give the truth without any mistakes. Moreover, even if someone did give it out, there will still be someone who, having perceived the text or words, will extract from it a different meaning than that which was put into it. Because the attitude to any text and to any words, it is always twofold. And this second side of the question, that from the text or words, they extract a meaning that has never been there, this also takes place. Therefore, I think that the question with analytics can be closed on this.
Let me explain to the audience. You mean the questions with Valery Viktorovich Pyakin, who releases videos with a frequency of about once a week on average, and covers events in political life, some kind of public life, interstate relations. That is, different kinds of directions. It is clear with him separately. But if we take in general all the analytics as a whole, as a branch of people's education, then there are different interpreters. Each interpreter, analyst, proceeds from some convictions, some kind of worldview that he has developed. That is, someone interprets the whole world politics as disagreements between the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, and in all manifestations, explosions, planes fall, something happens, he brings all this to the fact that it was the Rothschilds who defrauded the Rockefellers, or vice versa. Someone sees Masons in this and in any event. But there, a Masonic sign flashed somewhere in the crowd, so this is it. Someone from others proceeds from the premises. The question is, how for an ordinary person in this whole sea? And since YouTube, unlike what was before, we had one television and tried to get on there. The internet allows people, everyone, to sit down and chat on the camera whatever they want. How can ordinary people figure out who is right in general in this whole sea?
This is the most difficult question because if with ordinary people everything was normal, with the personal culture of psychic activity as a whole, with the personal culture of senses, and with the personal culture of intellectual activity, then this question would not arise. And there is only one life-consistent answer to it. Put things in order in your own psyche so that it does not get buggy, and master dialectics as the art of identifying non-determinacies and their meaningful resolution.
You now said in such a way that most people will say, to understand this sentence.
There are thoughts that do not fit into the standard subject-predicate and into the definite article with the letter B, which in the Russian language supposedly can be put anywhere and more than once in a sentence. The one who believes that between beer and football on television he can do great things, he is mistaken. Because in order not to be a victim of someone else's analytics or graphomania on political themes, you must first put all things in order in your own psyche. You can't get away from this. Order in one's own psyche is established on the basis of one primitive principle, unique in the lexicon, to live under the power of a dictatorship of Sovest. If you follow this path, then in about a year and a half, you can put things in order in your own psyche. After that, it will give out, in the majority of cases, results that are reliable enough for life in all analytical activities and prognostics. And if this is not done, then the Duma, the Federal Council, officials of all ranks, more than 20 years have passed since the Constitution has been working. No one can understand that the central bank is doing anything but work for the blago of Russia. 20 years have passed. No one in these authorities has realized that the liberal market economic model, towards which in Russia everything is tailored, is the generator of problems that in principle cannot be resolved in it. And if we want to live well, then we need to recreate the State Planning Committee, the scientific methodological support of the State Planning Committee, new, adequate, metrologically consistent and governorially consistent, on the basis of this to train cadres And then in 10 to 15 years, the country will enter the correct mode of governance and everything will be fine. I said this, and many may argue, but this is demagoguery. Alright, consider it demagoguery. But then don't ask where the problems come from and how to solve them.
Alright, if we go back to the veracity of analytics, do you think that if a person simply lives according to his совесть, then within a year his brain will thus become clearer and he will begin to understand?
Yes, he will work on himself, that is, rethink his past. And rethinking your past is not at the level, so I messed up then and was wrong. Yes, this level of comprehension and recomprehension of the past is necessary, but here we need a different level. And what are my nravya standards and what worldview mistakes led to the fact that I then chose this governorial decision, which turned out to be a mess-up? If a person goes to the level of revision of his nraviousness and revision of his worldview, then in about a year, the results will be achieved and he will produce a sufficient amount of his own analytics so as not to become a victim of Posner.
It turns out that for me, it is not quite coming together. A person can be completely sincere, well spiritually developed, and live according to his совесть. But what is analytics or interpretation? This is an interpretation of those facts that happen in life, that happen around a person, somewhere far away. That is, he may simply not even know many things.
He will then intuit that such things should be, because the sense of measure suggests that they simply cannot but exist. Further, only a question of detailization. If everything is very good, then he will intuit with an accuracy of personalities, addresses, and data. If the detailization is not very good, then he will intuit up to a social phenomenon, that supposedly there must be some social group that works for such and such objectives and carries certain methods and means of achieving them. And it will turn out exactly what is needed, and then this group will emerge and everything will be confirmed that yes, he was right. You just never need to forget that a person is not a unique intellect in and of himself, and that he himself is isolated from the world and nothing but information connects him with the world. It connects. The noosphere is not an invention of Teilhard de Chardin, it is not an invention of Vernadsky, it is reality, and it dominates over many things that happen on Earth, and above it there is still a lot of things, including the universal cosmic reason, and then the Most High.
Fine. Then what percentage of, shall we say, truth or more or less close to truth interpretations or explanations of current events are told in our mass media, if you somehow track them?
Our mass media are very bored when nothing happens. If any calamity or misfortune occurs, then the mass media becomes more active and begin to excitedly discuss this problem. If no misfortune or grief has happened, then the mass media are engaged in nonsense, as if there are no problems in the country and in the world that need to be solved. Why are they engaged in nonsense? This is twofold. On the one hand, there is a social order to keep the crowd out of politics, so that they don't go where they are not supposed to. On the other hand, if we talk about journalists as such, then the journalist is now doing what the hierarchs of the high Жрецу did in antiquity. A journalist, through the internet and television, to a lesser extent print media, utters some words addressed to the whole people. If by this time the high Жрец of Egypt had about 7 professions mastered at the professional level, great life experience, and knowledge of life on the basis of his senses, plus on the basis of texts, then what can the epoch-making 10th grader say after 5 years of study at the Faculty of Journalism if he does not know what metrology is? If he does not know how mathematical statistics differ from the theory of probability in life? In general, he knows little domain specifically, but he is ready to talk about everything blah blah blah. This is the level of our journalism. Exceptions to this are extremely rare, because in order to become an exception, one must live, work, not in the sphere of journalism, but work somewhere in another sphere, and then come to journalism. But we do not have enough such journalists. They can be counted on one hand.
Yes, but there are slightly different categories here. Journalists say, errand boys who are just gathering facts somewhere, run around on a location. And interpreters like Posner, Solovyov, they have life experience.
Here, the question is different. Who conducts the casting of interpreters?
I don't know.
This is the main question when we talk about who we see on the screens. Remember that episode, Sveta from Ivanova? We began to dress more better, she said. Sveta immediately hits the TV screen, leads some kind of program. Who selected? Who released?
The program is called Ray of Light.
What epoch-making, significant did she say? And how does it look against the background of Vladimir Rudolfovich Solovyov, or against the background of Ksenia Anatolievna Sobchak?
Here I must say that she's in the camp of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's admirers.
It is not a question of in whose camp she is, who she admires. The question is different. Who conducted the casting of those people who utter all sorts of words addressed to the whole people? In general, there was such an interesting episode. It was during the years of Perestroika. Gorbachev made a televised address to the whole people. He was sitting at a table, roughly as I am sitting. The camera was pointed at him, and behind him was a hefty, polished 3-door wardrobe. Some looked at Mikhail Sergeyevich's face and were moved. And some looked. And what is reflected there in the polished 3-winged cabinet? What are the assumptions?
Most likely there was a screen or paper with text.
There was a man sitting with his feet up on a coffee table and watching Gorbachev broadcast his words to all the people. To all appearances, it was not a live broadcast, but the guy who was sitting there in a pose demonstrating clear disrespect for the nominal head of state and the ruling party, he watched Mikhail Sergeyevich utter all sorts of words. He was satisfied with one of the variants and he said, "This is to be released." And now recall Roosevelt, the fireside chats. It is also impossible to imagine Stalin broadcasting words to all the people and someone sitting there with his feet up in an armchair lounging. Therefore, the question of casting is relevant not only in journalism and television, it is also relevant in what is happening in public politics. And the casting of candidates, it is outside the democratic procedures of our Constitution, of the Constitution of the United States, and the constitutions of other so-called democratic countries, which are sometimes set for us as an example.
And what is the general objectiveness of the mass media in this case?
The general objectiveness is such that there are many more nightmares on the screen than in life. Therefore, lies can be different. You can lie by inventing facts, you can lie by distorting facts, keeping silent about some facts, or you can lie by distorting the statistics of facts shown on the screen in relation to the statistics that have a real place in life. If a person perceives life from a picture of a TV screen, then he can thus be manipulated if he does not correlate what is shown to him with his sense of measure and his other senses. Further down the line, I think there will be more, because the next stage, some animator draws a 3 or more D politician, and the computer program says on behalf of the invented politician that which the orderers of the program consider necessary, and so on and so forth. That is, what is described in the story, Lieutenant Kijer can find life on the basis of modern multimedia technologies and corresponding computer software.
But it has already been acquired. A few years ago, I dabbled with home-level programs, not just some silicon graphics on computers. On ordinary PCs, Macs, there are programs that make a three-dimensional person. And not only that, you can record speech there, and in such a way that this speech is synchronized with the way he opens his mouth. The computer character will be synchronized to open his mouth for the speech. True, then it only worked for English, a few years ago.
There will be progress.
Then who owns the mass media? Who are those social orderers? Or are the mass media independent? Or are they subordinate to someone? Or is there a central government, Putin and his bloody regime, or what?
The mass media in modern conditions in developed countries is a mafia, because the principle of so-called freedom of speech and freedom of journalism, it is expressed in the fact that they take a student who is not the sharpest tool in the shed, who often does not want to work, but who has a lot of ambition. He graduates from the journalism faculty, and it turns out that the guys who get into the journalism faculty in any state, they have a so-called liberal mindset. A liberal mindset, well, in general, this is, after all, for a psychiatrist. Because if a person sincerely preaches liberal ideas, it means that he does not understand anything about the cause-effect relationships that take place in real life. And if he preaches insincerely, then he is either a swindler who wants to cheat all others. The principles of the great schemer are the principles of liberalism. Or he is a traitor who transfers the right to swindle to some foreign forces. If we talk about what the liberal mindset is, well, then on YouTube there is such a video. And the phone rang in the Kremlin. Have you seen it? Mikhail Yefremov jokingly tells a joke. Who wrote it? I don't know. The audience laughs. Guys, what, there are no problems in the country? After all, what is told in this video and the phone rang in the Kremlin, it is a variety of Moronism, or a variety of very accurate manipulation of the liberally, in quotes, thinking public. Some of the poets said that fools gather in packs. And if they gather in packs, then herd pack instincts work. And as is shown by zoopsychology, herd pack instincts do not work on the one who is smarter. They work on the one who is first to react. If the problematics is complex, then an adequate response takes some time. And an inadequate response based on defective intellect can be very quick and fleeting. Therefore, when liberals gather in pacts, it is not out of great intellect, clairvoyance, and everything else.
Not only liberals gather in packs. And then how to understand? The mass media work in whose interests? In their own, if it is the mafia. Or are they someone else's orders?
They partly work in their own interests, but life is built in such a way that if you see someone's incompetence and someone's moralism, then you must understand that incompetence and moralism are never ownerless. That is, it is necessary to look at who there is next to them, who is manipulating, in whose interests they are manipulating. But this cannot be understood without what is called structureless governance. If you have an idea of what structureless governance and governance based on virtual structures are, then you can see a lot of things. What is governed and how, although in the absence of understandings about what a method of structureless governance and a method of structural governance are, to you it will seem that these are random coincidences and self-activity which no one is manipulating. They manipulate, and they manipulate subtly. If we consider the process of manipulation over historically long intervals of time, then it is carried out in the following way. A new generation enters life. Someone is engaged in the formation of his world understanding, purpose-orientedly, for the solution of certain tasks. The generation grows up, the world understanding has become its property, and they are sincerely convinced that they themselves are beginning to do something that fully corresponds to the previously conceived project, which was formalized, perhaps at the level of the US National Security Council Directive 20/1 of August 18, 1948, which Gorbachev with Yeltsin and their team fulfilled point by point. Or it is not formalized. But on the basis of gossip, rumors, popular bardic songs, it is also possible to govern, not down to the smallest details, but the general trends in the development of society or the degradation of society.
Does anyone govern society meaningfully?
Society is always a self-governing system. There is always someone in society who aspires to govern it. And in some cases, if the personal culture of psychic activity allows, then they manage to govern it.
And if you take the same Gorbachev, he was, in my opinion, not a very good governor. However, he ended up at his post.
It is not even that he was a good or not a good governor. The point isn't something different. The point is that someone performed casting, and Gorbachev was promoted for the solution of certain political tasks, with which he completely coped.
But then it turns out that many politicians are just puppets like Gorbachev.
Both here and around the world.
And somewhere there are puppeteers who selected these puppets.
And the puppets work in automatic mode on the basis of that world understanding, raviousness and ethics that have taken shape in them. In some cases, a life partner raises her heel to the rank of some comrade's crown, and he lives and acts. In some cases, when it's believed that it's problematic to influence a woman from the outside, then the promotion of LGBT guys begins.
Then how to understand what are the plans of this great and big one who rules everyone? Or is he one, or maybe there are several of them, and they somehow interact with each other?
The plans are, in general, simple: to prevent a person from becoming a human. For this, the structure of the psyche of the bulk of the population is supposed to be approximately the same as that of monkeys. Everything is subordinated to instincts. Will and sophist are ousted, if possible, from decision-making. They are grazed by a certain number of zombies who have power over instincts but cannot go beyond culturally conditioned programs. After all, culture is simply an informational algorithmic system. The programmers are a certain number of comrades who realize their creative potential according to the principle that I do what I want without any obvious limitations. Well, a human turns out to be superfluous in this social system, unnecessary, subject to destruction or self-destruction. The striving for world domination is a means that is supposed to prevent the emergence of a civilization somewhere in the region of the planet where, by the beginning of adolescence, the bulk of the population will reach the human level of development and will live under the power of a dictatorship of service. Then the Earth will cease to be a planet of the apes and become a planet of people. You see, the question is not that we are anatomically different from other primates. The question is that the structure of the psyche of a monkey, it is uniquely given genetically, and the monkey will never egress from under the will of instincts. And the human should live under the power of the dictatorship of service, and instinctive programs of behavior should be blocked in cases where they are inappropriate. And the creative potential should be realized for blago, and not all permissively, solving those problems that are inherited from the past and not creating new ones. But if the task is to prevent the formation of a civilization of humanness, then everything is permissible, up to the rollback of civilization back into the Stone Age.
Why such a task posed then? Who benefits from it?
This task, if a person adheres to an atheistic world understanding, is an invention. If a person adheres to a religious world understanding, then a person was created in order to be the steward of God on the planet, to begin with. If the mission of God's stewardship does not suit someone, then the task of preventing this from happening is relevant. But this is an extra-social task, and in the atheistic world understanding, this task is the fruit of the sick fantasy of religiously complexed people who do not know physics and fill the ignorance of physics with their inventions about God and everything else.
Well, look what happens. In order to raise a human who is truly human, he needs an upbringing system. He needs teachers who accordingly will bring him up in this way. Because if a person is simply thrown into the jungle, he will remain there as Mowgli.
Mowgli, yes.
And he will never even learn to speak, even if he can be transported back to human society at the age of 5. But it turns out that if all the mass media, the system of education, are subordinated, roughly speaking, to bad uncles who need a herd of monkeys, how then will the sprouts of humanness appear?
Well, how will they appear? Not everyone turns out to be press-printed by the system. That is, humanness grows in all generations. And this is expressed by the fact that there is a saying, something human is not alien to anyone. The second side of the question consists in the fact that everything related to instinctive programs is the basic level of informational algorithmic support for the life of the biological species Homo sapiens. That is, this level is supposed to ensure the reproduction of populations in an automatic mode at a zero level of culture.
This is purely a monkey.
Yes, this is factually a pure monkey, but with potential. A pure monkey, absolutely a monkey, it has no potential. But man, he is with a certain potential. The potential is realized in culture. But if culture is a superstructure over instincts, while the starting conditions are that this is a monkey without culture, but it also talks and is with potential, then, in general, the herd-pack instincts of the monkey pack work, and an ordinary crowd-elite culture is built, which is the shell of instinctive programs of herd-pack behavior. But there are brains, there is sovest. It also begins to manifest itself, to activate itself. There arise questions on the theme that, guys, we actually live something like monkeys, but we must live somehow differently. But culture, as an informational algorithmic system, possesses a certain inertia in the aspect of reproducing itself. The culture of all crowd elite societies can be likened to the Japanese art of bonsai. When that tree, which in natural conditions could grow large and beautiful, they begin to cripple, and it's ankle high to a grasshopper. All cultures of crowd elite societies, including also the subculture of conception, carrying, upbringing and education of children, this is bonsai, but applied to man. Because if you look at what happens in families, then the main task of parents in most cases is to get the child to obey. If the child is obedient, then everything is fine. The task of upbringing is to prepare the child for adult life. And in adult life, he will need, if to live like a human being, not obedience, but initiative, will, and sovest. If parents achieve obedience, then the initiative is extinguished, the will does not develop, the sovest is worthless. Then the kids grow up, there is no will, no sovest, there is a readiness to serve the one who is higher in the hierarchy. And since there is also laziness, then to serve only if there is encouragement. And if there is a suspicion that someone else can provide more encouragement, then please, Malchishki Balchish is ready to sell anything for a box of cookies, a barrel of jam. And not because he is so smart and lives by the principle that there is no such concept to change, there is such a concept to foresee. He is just like that, crippled in childhood, and that's it.
Worldview is dynamic, that is, it develops in the course of intellectual activity. When a person is filled with new fragments of his own mosaic, does he need to consciously reconsider some beliefs in life, or leave them on autopilot?
Something will be consciously revised, something will happen by itself, and become conscious when a relevant need arises. But our main intellectual power, it is hidden in the unconscious levels of the psyche. From the level of consciousness, we can only ask questions, set tasks, they will somehow solve them there. And then, when they have solved them, you will find that in the past, in such situations, you thought one decision was optimal, but now you think that decision is wrong, and you make another decision. Moreover, not simply unmotivatedly, but realizing that that decision carried with it some negative concomitant effects, and now these effects are absent.
A question about governance, also clan showdowns, actions. In 1996, one of the people who oversaw the presidential elections in Russia was a Rothschild. I don't remember the first name now. This question was asked directly by colleagues. After the elections were over, this Rothschild left for Europe, flew away, and died suddenly in a hotel. That is, what was the element of the game? Did he fail to fulfill some agreements? How do you understand this?
No, it could simply have been an egregorial reaction. That is, the man fell into the internal affairs of Russia, into which, according to ethical correct principles, he should not stick his nose. As a result, they buried him. Don't meddle where you don't need to meddle.
And man's providence, can it be based only on constructiveness? Or on account of cause-effect relationships and the holisticness of all mankind? Maybe based on destruction or something like that.
But it depends on what to destroy. We destroyed the Third Reich, and the Soviet of none of the Russian people is pricked on this subject. They destroyed, and rightly so, because those guys were not engaged in what they should have been engaged in.
The question is also about history. Hyperborea, that is, if Atlantis perished 12,000 years ago, then what problems could there have been in Hyperborea?
If the catastrophe was global, it affected everyone in one way or the other. Because if you analyze the different facts which are cited by different researchers, you get such things that if the permafrost in Yakutia is full of mammoth deposits, it cannot arise just like that. But if Yakutia left to where it is, from the place where it was, and left in winter, then everything froze immediately within a day or two, like if you bring a tomato and put it in the freezer. Egypt also left, because the Sphinx was damaged by water erosion, and in the memory of the present civilization, it has been covered up with sand to its ears for the greater part of its existence. But our position is such that the question of what was the real past, in what relations Hyperborea was with Atlantis, what happened immediately after the catastrophe, and who and how restored governance, and was there a wooden ark, or were there also cosmic arks, in addition to this a refuge somewhere in the bowels of the earth, and so on and so forth. These are not very urgent questions. It is absolutely necessary to reveal what true history was. But to reveal what true history was in our understanding is possible only in the case where we form a project of a previous future, implement this project, and then the memory of the noosphere will be accessible. And without any fantasies about interpretations and archaeological finds, we will have reliable ideas about our past. In the meantime, the culture is what it is, including personal. Many things on the theme of reconstruction of the true, correct history, they fit into the stream of the anecdote from back in the Soviet times that a wire was found at the excavations in Tbilisi, and this suggests that the ancient Georgians had wire telegraph. After some time, Armenian radio reports no wire was found at the excavations of Yerevan, and this suggests that the ancient Armenians had wireless telegraph.
Does history belong to the instruments of governance towards society?
Of course, the conception of history, which is cultic in society, belongs. The most striking example is, perhaps, the question of the history of the Second World War. Because if you count it from September the 1st, 1939, then Poland is an innocent victim of aggression, Stalin is an evil maniac, buddied up with the evil maniac Hitler, and so then they together destroyed white, fluffy Poland. If you count from September the 30th, 1938, then Poland and Germany are allies who tore apart Czechoslovakia. The sanction for this was given by Great Britain, and France, for some reason, fell under Great Britain, contrary to its own interests. Accordingly, the fact that one ally of the anti-Soviet coalition decided to attack another ally, this is an internal matter of the coalition. And then we get a completely different picture of the course of the Second World War. Its results will also not be the same as in the cultic version of history. This example leads to the fact that history as such is the totality of all biographies of people in all details that have ever lived. But history in such a form is accessible only to the Almighty. What is our history? Our history is a selection of some biographies and some facts from this one. And then the question arises, when does the conception of history as a selection of facts and biographies lose its life consistency and become a historical myth that hides real history?
When the power changes.
Not only when the power changes, because it turns out that one power can be for one historical myth, another power can be for another historical myth, the opposition for the third, another opposition for the fourth, and all these myths are absurd. The question is, what history is not nonsense? That is, what kind of selection gives an idea of history which, in fact, is in the entirety of biographies and facts? But this theme in the scientific literature, which is written by historians, it is not discussed. To say nothing of the fact that the study of history based on research, it already initially contains an error, because the one who writes the document, in most cases, is interested in hiding their oversights, mistakes, and abuses, and that they not be reflected in the document.
They are bad, they attacked us.
Yes, they are bad. Maybe they didn't attack, but even in internal politics. They are scoundrels. We saved the people from scoundrels. We won. We are writing history, and therefore our position is correct. What really happened there? This can be understood only by gaining access to the memory of the noosphere. And in order to gain access to the memory of the noosphere, it is necessary to reach a certain level of personal development, including nravious ethical. And further, there arises one more question. Fine, someone gets access to the memory of the noosphere, writes a history course. And we have a pluralism of opinions. There is such a historical school, there is such a historical school. How will a simple, poor everyman, after reading all history courses, tell which one is true?
In no way he will be given one.
Yes, in no way. Therefore, the question of what history was in such conditions, it is relevant, but it is not the first in significance. The first in significance question is the question of the project of the future, which will be supported from above and of the realization of this project. When this task is solved and its solution has become real life, then the memory of the noosphere will open, and all demagoguery on peri-historical themes will fade by itself. And many of our current history textbooks will be read simply like a collection of fairy tales and fictions.
Probably all history textbooks will be read this way.
Well, not all, but a lot of them will be read like collections of fairy tales and fictions.
A question about the project of the future. Recently, at the UN General Assembly, Putin said from the rostrum that we need to switch to some kind of nature-like technologies. Is he talking about the development of some already existing scientific developments within the framework of the general accepted paradigm? Or could it be that history is entering a new round of repetition of possibly the technology of a previous biological civilization?
Well, this question is not for me, but for Vladimir Vladimirovich. But if you look at the same problem from the outside, then, of course, there are technologies that are not in demand and are suppressed. And in the same speech, he asked one more question. Do you at least understand what you have done? This question, by and large, refers not only to politics, but in general to the way of life of Western civilization. And it claims that they are the leader of civilizational development and teachers of all mankind. What Vladimir Vladimirovich said at the United Nations and the questions he raised there, they are more a hint at a whole slew of defaults that he simply could not announce during the time he spoke there. And the second question is related to this. And who of those present there would have been able to understand him if he had set out everything in detail? And more than that, are obviously ready to agree that the position of Russia is not some kind of unmotivated aggression against the civilized West, but this is an indication of the problems that need to be solved in a historically short time in order that the Western way of life does not become suicidal for all of humanity. Therefore, the question of the project of the future is really relevant. What Jacques Fresco did in the West, this is only technospheric aspects. And the main question is, what is a human, and how to become a human? Because the culture is variative, including the pedagogical subculture, and you can raise zombies, you can raise cattle, or you can raise people.
And if we talk about personal development, for example, one person decides to live according to his совесть. That is, does this mean that one will have to give up his family, the other, his personal housing, his work?
Well, something will have to be abandoned, but совесть, it always gives concrete solutions in concretely taken shape circumstances.
That is, it does not mean that you have to be on some kind of altar throughout your life.
This speaks to the fact that self-liquidation is meaningless. A person must eat, nourish, be dressed, have a roof over his head, for the simple reason that none of us can live in the light and warmth of our own aura now. If you lived in the light and warmth of your own aura, then you would shine. Warmth, the organism feels good, clothes are not needed, or they are burned out in the aura without harm to the body. You go into the street, no one sees your nakedness behind the light of the aura, there is not a complex on this theme. Nourishment by the Holy Spirit is possible, the technosphere is not needed, but this is a different way of life for civilization. Now, while we are as we are, it's necessary to sort out the legacy of the past and personally develop so that the technosphere does not kill civilization. Because for the moment, humanity is a monkey with an atomic bomb.
And what tasks could be solved by such a civilization, which would be without the technosphere?
We cannot imagine this now. Wisdom and raviousness are not enough for this.
Is it correct to understand that those people who do daily labor that they do not like, that is, go to work that they don't like, shall we say then, in principle, they are volitional people?
Or willless.
We just talked before filming. I say that these are willless people who cannot change their lives. But Alexander says that, on the contrary, they are volitional people. They overcome reluctance, take themselves by the scruff of the neck and carry themselves to work.
Here it could be different. A person understands the significance of what he is doing for society, regardless of whether he understands the significance correctly or erroneously. But if he is convinced that it's necessary to do this, then he can do the unloved work with high quality, so that he does not need to be checked, and no one needs to watch over his shoulder, so that he does everything as it should be. But there is no need to say that this is a mass phenomenon in our country, because the main problem of Russia is non-dobrosovestiousness in labor and in everyday life. Well as in politics.
What are the reasons for this non-dobrosovestiousness?
And the reasons for non-dobrosovestiousness are partly non-understanding and partly willlessness. In general, everyone has their own reasons. Everyone finds an excuse for their own non-dobrosovestiousness, but one way or the other, the thesis is revealed. We are not like that, but life is like that.
Everyone wants to live, but we are not to blame.
But it's us who creates life.
How do we create life? How can one person change the whole system if, for example, he does not like it? He understands that it is vicious.
He can launch processes in it that will change the system in some time. But here another question arises. This raises the question of the person's selflessness. Because if it comes to him that he will not use the fruits of his activity in this life, then why should he engage in such an activity? He needs here and now, everything, and not just everything, but everything straight away. But here and now, straight away, in the aspect of consumption, or rather in the aspect of affluenza, it is not achievable. And the technosphere, in the form in which it is, it should, after all, stimulate us to develop correct nraviousness and pravious ethics. And if this process is flowing correctly, then the thesis "made in Russia" should be perceived as a quality mark and not as a warning about danger.
Mikhail Viktorovich, there was also such a question. Some guys ask about spiritual practices. How to find the right measure?
In general, if we talk about the Russian tradition, then the Russian tradition has always had a negative attitude towards spiritual practices, because practices are a kind of psychological hacking. That is, unauthorized access to those resources and powers of the organism which are, for various reasons, blocked. The Russian tradition oriented people on personal development precisely in the aspect of nraviousness, the formation of pravious ethics, and then an accompanying effect of this personal development was that which in the Orthodox tradition is called the gifts of the Holy Spirit. If we turn to the texts of the New Testament, then at the time of the Apostles, just after Christ, the manifestation of gifts of the Holy Spirit was an indicator that a person had really accepted the doctrine and was not hypocritical. Many centuries have passed, and the flock of the Orthodox Church, for the most part, has been deprived of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. That is, according to the criteria of the early years, there is some kind of falsity in what they call Christianity. What is the difference? The difference will be that the gifts of the Holy Spirit are safe for both their possessor and those around him. And psychological hacking, based on various kinds of practices, it can be dangerous both for the person himself and for those around him. If this danger becomes excessive, then there is an intervention from above up to the suppression of life, long before the exhaustion of the biological resource of the organism.
That is, it turns out that if a person lives according to his совесть and correctly, it is as if knowledge is given to him from above, right?
Knowledge and skills are given from above, just master it. If he does not master something, or cannot by virtue of the peculiarities of the organism, then he will not get into those situations when it's necessary to use it. Or, if he finds himself in such situations, there will be some other support from above, which will compensate for his inconsistency in some aspects. How this support from above will be expressed is already a question of the concretics of this or that situation and its development.
And when he's engaged in psychological or various types of practices, this is a kind of hacking into the system. He sneaks through and takes it.
This is a hacking of the system. In addition, sufficiently often this is accompanied by zombifying effects, because in all systems there is a certain finite set of actions that lead to these or those objectives. This finite set of actions, becoming alternativeless programs, zombifies a person, and he cannot egress from the program. And if he does not bother with these very practices, does not become their hostage and slave, then possibilities for personal development open and remain. And he does not develop a complex on the theme that someone there is Raja Yogi. This is for the public. And not for the public that this very same Raja Yogi has some kind of problem, such as diabetes mellitus, oncology, which he suppresses by an effort of will. But this is not made public.
And the reasons for these hacker break-ins are probably demonism or something else.
In general, this is one of the attributes of Vedic culture as a whole. The Brahman must surpass the crowd in all other castes, and accordingly, casting should be carried out. Guru and reproduction of a certain subculture is also carried out. But if this could solve the problem of the civilizational development of the planet, most likely we would live in a different culture, and yoga cultures would lie at the basis of civilization.
Why do you think that the planet follows such a reasoning path? If conditionally to say that a city is a planet, it developed, then the bad ones came, seized, established their power. Whoever says something, off with your head, and that's it.
This variant is also possible, only here there is one more side of the question. If the bad ones came and did something, then they did it and they were able to achieve the result only because there were some internal preconditions. There was some internal defectiveness. Because, as already mentioned, if a comrade invades, but there are no internal prerequisites, then, as in the film White Son of the Desert, are there grenades? Yes, there are, but not of the right system. The comrade flies out of the window or does not return at all to where he came from.
You can simply crush by force, by several times stronger. Relatively speaking, there are many more bad ones. That's it. They came, they tied Vereshchagin's hands, that's all.
This is where either noospheric algorithmics or general cosmic algorithmics come into play. If there are more bad ones and they meddle where they don't need to meddle, then they begin to be severely unlucky.
For some reason, this is not visible that the Americans are cruelly unlucky. They meddle where they don't need to.
Here the question is such: there where they are meddling, how is it there? There too, to put it mildly, it's not very good. And in other aspects of the development of culture, it can be even worse than in America.
Was it worse than in America, in the Soviet Union?
In the Soviet Union, far from everything was blissful.
I agree, but nevertheless, quite a few things, in my opinion, were also better than in the USA. In terms of social structure and upbringing.
If we talk about the history of Russia, then whatever we have, if we consider in a historical retrospective, post-Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, the Moscow Tsardom, the system of principalities which figure out with each other who is more important. Always one and the same, the tribal system in different social packages. Because if the Soviet Union lived in accordance with the Constitution of 1936, it would be the only superpower and the leader of civilizational development. But the Constitution is not to blame. It is the citizens who, not caring a lick for this Constitution, who were to blame. They had their own interests in life, everyday life. You are not a guest at work, at least steal a nail. And in the States, there is a different system. There is no tribal system in the States. The problem of the tribal system is the cyclics of generation and degradation of elites. A catastrophe happens. The tribal system is pulled out of the catastrophe by someone, and an elite of the first generation is formed. The elite of the first generation is more or less functionally capable. Further, it begins to reproduce itself in the continuity of generations, and by the third generation, there is one more or less functionally capable out of 100 elite. His reaction to everything else in general is equivalent to the famous words of Lavrov.
في المعارضة السورية وكما تعلمون أجرينا مرتين ما يسمى بمنتدى موسكو في فبراير وأبريل الماضي ولكننا نواصل.
Further, when in the third or fourth generation of the elite, 99% are functionally incapable, they create internal preconditions for another catastrophe to occur. What this catastrophe will be, this is the 10th matter. Either an internal crisis or someone from the outside will help, but nonetheless there will be a catastrophe. Then the regression from the catastrophe begins, the generation of a new elite. In the first generation, it is again functionally capable, but while the tribal system is going on, 3 or 4 generations passed, and again a Lavrov situation arises. They have no answerability, another catastrophe. So in the USA, there is no such cyclics. Because in the States, the system of behind-the-scenes selection of cadres, which is carried out by Freemasonry, it ensures that people, in general, not noble-born in relation to the previous elite, to the past generations of the elite, but functionally capable, that they move up into the sphere of governance. Therefore, such personalities as Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, are possible there. Their childhood fell on a period when racism was the norm of life. Nevertheless, the guys got to the top. I do not want to say that they are geniuses, pravius, and all that, but in relation to the system of social governance of the United States, they are adequate. That the system as a whole is inadequate is another matter. The United States does not possess full sovereignty. The United States is conceptually powerless. They cannot go beyond the biblical doctrine, and this is their problem. But within the framework of the biblical project, the States is a sufficiently effective system, and therefore they are the leader of civilizational development on the basis of the biblical project. The fact that the project is suicidal and generates problems that cannot be solved within it, this is beyond the understanding of American science and European science.
You say there is no tribal system in the States, but the brightest indicator, both father and son Bushes, please, the presidents of the United States. Then if you look through the biography of any president and the highest elite of these senators, they all have a dad, a senator or a mayor, or a big businessman or something else. They're from the people. There is no one.
But in the States there were no anecdotes of the type, Leonid Ilyich asks his grandson, "Who do you want to be?" General Secretary. Why do we need two general secretaries?
But what is the point? Well, instead of one Bush, another Bush, instead of this one, another one. That is, there is an elite there too.
But their Bush is not obligatory. The system admits not only Bush, and our system is arranged in such a way that the principles of the tribal system,
We had people from the people.
in positions that mean little.
Stalin, Putin.
Stalin is the first generation after the catastrophe. That is, this is not an objection. But if we talk about the fact that here, Tupolev transferred the design bureau to his son, nothing good came of it. Of the associates of the elder Tupolev, there was only one opponent. All the rest agreed, as it should be, in conditions of the tribal system.
And Putin?
Again, right after a catastrophe. That is, this is not an objection. Let's look at what happens in the third generation, or on the eve of a catastrophe. The father of Yegor Timurovich Gaidar, admiral. In the Navy, I don't know a single person who remembered the times of service with him very fondly. There are no good memories there. A position is created for him. He is an admiral working at the newspaper.
Does this mean that if we do not change the system of accession to power now, then in 2 or 3 generations, modern Russia will face the fate of the Soviet Union? In 2 years.
The fact is that history is accelerating. In fact, the current elite, both in politics and in business, it is already inadequate. This is already the second generation, or the heirs, the successors of those. Because, fine, with the father of Yegor Timurovich being a cabinet admiral, about whom they said at one of the editorial meetings, "You do not look like an admiral, but you look more like a rear." But who is Yegor Timurovich on the eve of the catastrophe? Yegor Timurovich is a member of the editorial board of the Communist magazine. Why he and not someone else? That is, if we talk about how the catastrophe of the Soviet Union happened, then those commies who were unable to build communism due to moronism, They took the position of Malchish Kibalchish to hand over the country for a box of cookies and a barrel of jam. And they did so, but they failed to gain a foothold. The bloody KGB regime replaced the correct liberal regime, if in their terms. So under Yeltsin there was freedom, but now allegedly there is none.
I haven't heard an answer to the question. If we don't change the system of accession to power now, will it be the same or what?
Yes, in general, we must egress from the tribal system. Ethics and nraviousness must be different and must ensure promotion in service. In civilian, in military service, not in accordance with family ties and empty ambitions, but in accordance with nravious ethical qualities and professionalism.
And then there will be an opportunity to open up through life, right?
Then there will be an opportunity. Then the country will develop.
This is possible only in two cases: a catastrophe or martial law.
It is impossible in either case. This is possible only if people, personally developing, do not shy away from entering power, entering political parties, washing brains, discrediting the leadership of political parties, the so-called, that is, speaking the truth, without evading. And when people take the position, this is them and we are so good here, then the sphere of governance, both in business and in politics, degrades. The country heads towards catastrophe. And the only question is, when the catastrophe breaks out, will there be someone who will take up this very power as the Bolsheviks took it up in 1917? After all, you see, had governance in the empire been adequate, then the fact that there were such Bolsheviks, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, and other comrades, only narrow specialists in the history of political parties of the late 19th, early 20th centuries would know. But the Romanovs did everything to disrupt the evolutionary scenario of development. Even if we do not touch on the question of the cook's children, then there was such a Zubatov. Zubatov believed that the working class should possess certain social guarantees. And when labor legislation was adopted at the end of the 19th century, the police were in favor of the workers possessing certain social guarantees. And Witte, who at that time, if I am not mistaken, headed the Ministry of Finance and Trade, or whatever it was called, he stood against, on the side of the capitalists, an extremely liberal market economic model without any social guarantees. Witte's point of view prevailed in many ways, because Zubatov was slandered and removed from service, but the police were really in favor of social guarantees for the working class for the simple reason that in those days the bulk of the population were still believers. And for a believer it was problematic to overstep the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," when there are riots in factories. And therefore the police were interested in the fact that there were no riots in the factories. In order that there would be no mass riots, certain social guarantees are needed. But social guarantees are a fall in the rate of profit of a private entrepreneur. Therefore, the government stood on the side of the private entrepreneur, well, and overstood.
Yes, but you see, you yourself gave an example. When a more honest and correct person is squeezed out by a system of those who are more swindlerish and those who want to fill their pockets. How can such people then get into power, if there are a lot of examples, when they are simply kicked out of there?
It is always in the concretics of the circumstances. Power is generally multifaceted. This is not only work in the state apparatus, not only work in the directorates of these or those enterprises. Therefore, each person, he can take on a certain responsibility for how to realize this very power, which is from God. And further already, including entering political parties, the state apparatus. In general, it always turns out that if incompetent guys are in leadership positions, then they need professional assistance. In the conditions of the Soviet tribal system, it was possible to reach the level of a colonel precisely as a professional. Further, there were already problems. Because the generals are the nomenclature, and there are too many sons-in-law, nephews, grandchildren, etc., etc., but for the most part, it was possible to reach the level of colonel. This level is able to solve a lot, provided that these are not loners.
But this is already a military conspiracy.
This is not a military conspiracy. If we talk about military conspiracies, then the trouble is precisely that those who start them up, they usually have no idea what to do next. Because if a course was taught in military schools of the type organization of a state coup d'etat and restoration of governance and the economy after that, then there would be no guys like Pinochet. Because such a course, in general, would have prevented such ambition of the type overthrow the current government, sit on the throne and begin to steer. Because those who undertake this, for the most part, do not understand the problematics that will then have to be disentangled. And when they are involved in such coups, the scheme of manipulation usually works like this. You, they say, are charismatic. The people love you. There is an objection. Yes, but I am neither an ear nor a snout in the economy. But this is not a problem. We will give you some people in assistance. Look what talented young guys we have here. Chubay, Skaidar. Boris Yeltsin agrees. And then it turns out that the problems are such for which he signed up and about which no pre-warnings were given. And young and talented guys cannot solve them and only create new problems. And what to do?
Anyway, then how can honest people get to the top and into the system of governance? Moreover, this may not necessarily be state power. Sometimes it can be education, science, culture.
Further arises the question of cadre politics, because cadre politics is being carried out at some level. That same casting. Casting in the Soviet times was carried out according to the principle, so this fool is interfering with our work here, he can't be fired, so where to place him? To promote him. Let him go from our enterprise there and there, so as not to interfere here. Nobody thought about the fact that later they would have to live under the rule of this fool and scoundrel.
Does he end up in the ministry?
Yes, they themselves promoted him there. How were the elections carried out? According to the principle, as long as it isn't me.
That's right, the workload. Have to stay after work, do something.
Yes, this, as long as it isn't me, was expressed in the fact that those who do not want to work and do not know how to work go and pronounce the correct words. As a result, there is Hakamada, a teacher of scientific communism or political economy, I don't remember exactly of what. Where is Sobchak from? Also from there. Because if you look at what he did in the last Soviet years, he was the head of the Department of Economic Law. For the Americans, in order to command an aircraft carrier, 2 diplomas are required, navigational and flight. Because if there is only one, then either he can lead the ship, but will lead it in such a way that all aviation will be beaten, or he can fly, but cannot lead the ship. To be a commander of an aircraft carrier, you need 2 diplomas. Department of Economic Law, what does it involve? A person should know perfectly everything of economic theories, of Marxism and of opponents, plus mathematical models on the basis of which problems are solved at the macro and micro levels, and in addition to this, jurisprudence. If we judge by the Constitution, of which Sobchak was one of the authors, then he knew less about economics than the cook who runs the household. But at the same time, he spoke a lot and beautifully without a piece of paper. Again, the years of perestroika. Gorbachev appeared. Now many cannot imagine how this all looked under Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. Leonid Ilyich went up to the podium in Baku in Azerbaijan at some solemn event and began to read the text from a piece of paper. A few minutes later, he began to stutter. Then he stopped and said, "Comrades, it's not my fault, something wrong was slipped to me." The reference came running, gave other pieces of paper, and Leonid Ilyich began to read the report again. Reading from a piece of paper. Moreover, Leonid Ilyich was not doing very well with diction. People were getting tired, and then there appears a young Gorbachev, who talks about everything without a piece of paper. Oh, how smart! He says everything without a piece of paper. And in the 90s there was a series called Shogun. In this series, one of the characters is characterized by the words, "Mr. Taranaga is very smart, he rarely makes mistakes." There are in general 2 criteria of the mind. One says a lot about everything without a piece of paper, and the other criterion is that he may speak little, but he is rarely mistaken. So the Soviet Union was led to the fact that Mikhail Sergeyevich says a lot about everything and without a piece of paper.
And what to do then?
Well, move to the criteria. Someone is smart if they rarely make mistakes. And among other things, for 1,300 years in the Quran, the recommendation, follow those who ask of you no fee and who are rightly guided. That is, the person is not self-interested, and besides this, he really cares about the welfare of everyone, that is, everything is in order with his nraviousness. But the criteria of nraviousness, they somehow in the last century have gone somewhere into the background, because it is believed that the main thing is to be clever and professional, and if he is a villain, he will anyway work for the blago of a certain corporation, which we will somehow work our way into. Or he will have nowhere to go, he will work for the blago of the country. But he will not work for the blago of the country, because the nravs are not all right there.
What then is the practical mechanism for these people to get into power or governance?
The practical mechanism is simple. Take responsibility, go and suppress.
I'm talking about a military coup.
This is not a military coup, because a military coup presupposes the emergence of a junta, and this presupposes diffusion, mass penetration.
In principle, as it is happening now, little by little.
In general, little by little it is happening. The politics of the so-called bloody KGB regime is correct in this respect, not to scare anyone. In what meaning? Many seek repressions. The state apparatus and the juridical system that are, if you allow repression, they will reproduce the year of 1937, or even worse. Because bureaucrats have no honor, no совесть. Give them only an opportunity to charge according to political articles, and give them back the death penalty again, they'll create such havoc. What prevents one from calling a fool, a villain?
They will kick him out of work.
No, even in the process of such discussions. After all, pay attention. Saji Umalatova proposed to the Congress of People's Deputies to remove Gorbachev and bring him to justice. What did the Congress do? Did not support this initiative. At the party Congress, literally in the first 5 minutes, also a Congress delegate from the Far East, sorry, I don't remember the name, also raised the question of how to guarantee the immunity of delegates to the 29th Congress, continue its work, and consider the activities of all members of the Politburo and the Central Committee on the theme about whether it corresponds to the ideals of socialism. Gorbachev immediately gagged him, and the Congress never returned to this question. This is still some progress in comparison with the 20th Congress, where the question that, Nikita, you have been lying your tongue off and generally slander the past and are flinging nonsense, did not even arise. The country should develop in such a direction that if someone is steering the wrong way and in the wrong way, and someone among the delegates, party, or parliamentary deputies raises the question of the activities of this comrade, then the question does not sink, but a commission is created that considers it. And if the accusations are confirmed, then to the fullest extent, without the further right to occupy leading positions ever for him and his children, up to the 3rd generation. But the country must mature before that. Society must change, and it must come to the conclusion that the state is us, but not that the state is something alien, but it must serve us. It will never serve us if the state is it, and we are us. If the state is us, then the state apparatus will serve us.